won't you talk to the Palestinians? Why would you do that?
I'll go back to that in a second, but David, let me ask you about the larger Arab world, because the truth is that I don't think that the Palestinians exist as an independent entity from the rest of the Arab world, and well, I don't think they exist as an independent entity. There. Thank you. And therefore they're not immune to the influence of states that are very hostile to Israel and have no compelling motivation to either really or theoretically change their motivation. So what would prevent a Palestinian state, even if the Palestinians were sincere, from being a launching pad for elements from Yemen, from Libya, from places that clearly are sort of irredeemably hostile to Israel?
Years ago, my wife was UCLA assistant director at Hillel, and there was an Israeli analyst who came and he spoke to the students, and he said, this is a plan for peace with Syria, and the Golan would return to Syria, and this would be the plan. And the students were like dumbfounded. How could you give the Golan? And I've done this. I've been on the tours. I went into the bunkers, and they went on, and he said, you don't understand. If there's a peace agreement, there's a whole different atmosphere. Now, he's not saying we're handing it over. He's not saying that. He laughed, but the idea is when you're in a situation where if you, say, attack, you're going to get it worse. There are so many factors that go into negotiations. In the bottom line, it's your own interests. Sadat didn't become a Zionist. He became and stayed an Egyptian who felt that making peace with Israel was better than continuing a war footing. So the idea is that I'm not saying we're jumping to the end point, but if you talk about the West Bank as it is today, or as you could picture it, with all hostility, we're missing a picture here of the desire and the need for conflict and for Israel's sake. And that means there's an Arab League that has an interest. That means that there's the US that has an interest. It means that Israel's not alone in this. But if Israel continues to move on a platform that is just not tenable, they're not going to have the support. So the idea is, we're talking about it in a vacuum of conflict and war. It's a step-by-step process, but we can't stop step 1 by saying, well, step 10 is just going to fail.
Let me actually turn that to you, Martin, by expanding the picture. Okay, I remember when Jeffrey Goldberg, who's going to be back here, by the way, in January from the Atlantic magazine, was here, and we were talking about the Armenian genocide and why wasn't the government of Israel willing to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. And he said to me, because it would offend the Turks. I said, why do we care so much about offending the Turks, who are offended these days? But I said, why do we care so much about offending the Turks? And he said to me, there's no airspace above Israel. Where do you think the Air Force does their exercises? They do it above Turkey. He says, you want the Israeli Air Force to be able to train, then you have to have relations with the Turks. In other words, there's a wider world here. When the United States says, in order for us as a government to feel that we're okay with various elements of the world, we have to work towards a two-state solution, then doesn't it become in Israel's interest to understand that there is, for example, if you want the United States cooperation with Iran, and the United States says, look, to be partners with you with Iran, we need an easing of tensions in the Middle East. The two-state solution, I think what David's saying, is not only about Israel and the Palestinians, it's about Turkey, it's about Iran, it's about the United States. And when you say politicians capitulated to politics by saying two-state solution, I could imagine one of those politicians, were he resurrected, saying to you, that's what politicians do. They take into account political issues because without political, diplomatic negotiations and smoothing and statements and so on, no state can survive. Israel can't survive as isolated in the world as it is now indefinitely, and the only way to end that isolation is to convince the world that Israel is actually trying to make peace.
Well, apart from committing national suicide, I'm not quite sure what Israel has to do to prove that it actually wants peace. Now, people with my views in the early 90s were on the margins of Israeli society. We were maligned, we were boycotted, we were sanctioned, we warned of what was happening. And I cannot for the life of me think what has to happen for people like peace now to say, we're wrong, we made a mistake, let's try and correct it, let's do it quickly, because what we're doing is eroding and making Israel's position untenable. Because if you believe that a Palestinian state is practical and it can exist side by side with Israel, then Israel's wrong. Then Israel should withdraw, and Israel should set up a Palestinian state. And why hasn't it happened up to now? Why hasn't it happened up to now? If you look at what the Palestinians have had, and compare it to any other movement of national liberation since the breakup of empire, they've had unmitigated support of the superpower for decades in the Cold War, because the Soviet Union supported them to the hilt. There were more officers of PLO around the world than there were Israeli embassies. It's had massive endorsement internationally of its claims. It's had wall-to-wall favorable media coverage. It's had huge international aid. In fact, you have a strange situation today where disposable income in the territories is higher than GDP. And I challenge you to find any other country in the world that has that. It's had nearly 2 decades of Israeli administration who not only acknowledged Palestinians' claims, but identified with them in many cases and built a political credo on that identification. And up until this moment, the Palestinians have not been able to produce anything that remotely resembles, even in spite of Tom Friedman's last article in the New York Times about the stock exchange in Nablus, have not been able to produce anything that remotely resembles a stable, productive civil society.
Exactly.
One second. Before I lose my train of thought. Under the Fatah, they've managed to set up a corrupt kleptocracy. Under the Hamas, a tyrannical theocracy. And under both chronic chaos. Why would anyone who purports to cherish liberal values think that there's any reason to support something which will be the antithesis of the very values they invoke for its establishment?